start time now. Obviously, a huge congratulations to my opponents for making it to the quarterfinals. Thanks to my judges for being here. Let's have a great debate. The resolution for today's round is as follows. The United States federal government ought to prioritize the development of fossil fuels over investment in alternative energy sources. Let's start with some brief definitions to kind of clarify what this resolution means and what the burden for both sides are. First, we think that in the context of this resolution, development of fossil fuels means mostly technological development. So things like trying to develop new ways of extracting them, new ways of controlling emissions from fossil fuels, etc. That's the most reasonable definition, since most development of renewable energy is also technological, so it provides the best comparison for both sides. The main conflict here in terms of what the government does is that the government has a limited amount of research funding. It can either allocate that funding towards doing things like developing new kinds of renewable energy or investing in that kind of renewable energy, or it can direct that funding towards trying to make fossil fuels more sustainable. And so the question this resolution asks to us is, ought we to prioritize trying to make fossil fuels sustainable, or trying to move trying to move away from fossil fuels in the short term? And we will affirm that it's better to make those fuels sustainable. We value utilitarianism, and our value criterion is who reduces human suffering the most. We think that's the most fair, reasonable for both sides, allows for pretty even ground. And so we will advocate that developing new ways of controlling the emissions from fossil fuels is a more effective way of solving global warming, both more cheaply and more easily than by trying to shift immediately to new kinds of renewable energy. Any questions on the framework? Okay, great. Our first contention has to do with carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and sequestration, also known as CCS. So CCS is a new technology that started to be developed in roughly the past 10 or 20 years that basically allows the emissions from fossil fuels, such as coal, such as oil, such as natural gas, to be captured on their way out of a power plant or wherever the fuel is being burned, and then to be concentrated and stored, usually underground somewhere where they're not going to escape, not going to affect the atmosphere. And so what it means is that we can still produce carbon dioxide through fuels like coal, fuels like oil, etc., but instead of having that carbon dioxide enter into the atmosphere and cause increased global warming, we can instead bottle up those emissions and pour them underground where they don't affect anything. Now, there are a couple ways of doing this kind of filtration. Many of them involve charcoal, other methods, some of them involve water vapor, but suffice to say there are a number of different technologies developed recently that allow power plants to basically burn fuels but not allow those emissions to go into the environment. The problem is that U.S. funding is needed to allow this to progress further simply because of the cost of these new technologies. It is technologically feasible to do these kinds of carbon sequestration and storage. The problem is it's just so expensive right now for power plants. That said, with U.S. research funding, which is currently not forthcoming, we could fairly effectively control the costs of carbon sequestration and storage, which would allow us to be able to implement these kinds of things in many more power plants. So whereas right now it's really only a few plants that are doing this as a test, we could have it so that most power plants in the United States, most power plants globally that burn fuels like coal, fuels like oil, would be able to control those emissions more effectively through capturing those emissions and storing them underground. This is especially important because China and India, which China is the first largest emitter, and India is the third largest and soon to be the second largest emitter, are not likely to reduce their emissions anytime soon. Both of them have very significantly increased their consumption of coal, which is the dirtiest fuel that produces the most carbon dioxide over the past few years, and it's estimated that by 2020, the total consumption of the total global consumption of coal will have doubled, almost entirely due to demand from China and demand from India. And they continue to show no sign of stopping. And so the only way that we will prevent those kinds of things from driving us over the brink and having too much warming is by having a technology that allows us to capture those emissions and bottle them underground. Because China and India have shown no interest in developing new kinds of renewable energy or shifting their infrastructure from coal-based or oil-based infrastructure to other kinds of renewable infrastructures. This means we need to find a way to make coal sustainable, to make oil sustainable, and the way to do that is through carbon capture and storage, which means that we need U.S. funding. The impact of this is that we saw global warming. And obviously global warming has a lot of impacts, which is that when temperatures rise at a global level because carbon dioxide traps heat in the air, that tends to lead to things like melting glaciers, which raises sea levels, leads to displacement of people that are by the coast, and also disrupts a number of other ecosystems in ways that are both economically disruptive and also lead to deaths and suffering across the globe, as well as displacement, war, etc. Our second contention is that developing fossil fuels is better for the economy. Specifically, both India and China depend for their continued growth and for continuing to lift people out of poverty on having continued access to these kinds of fossil fuels. This means that if the United States pursues a strategy that's centered on trying to get everyone to convert over to renewable energy, either this strategy will fail because countries like China and India won't go along with it, or if it succeeds, then China and India's growth will be stunted. The problem with this is that China's and India's growth right now has been a miracle for solving poverty. Hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of poverty in China alone, as well as in India, mostly due to economic growth that is powered by manufacturing, that is powered by fossil fuels. Which means that if China and India were to switch too drastically to renewable energy, if we center our strategy around making everyone shift to renewable energy, we force countries like China and India to choose between having economic growth and having the ability to solve their environmental problems. If the United States funds efforts to develop new kinds of carbon capture and storage that countries like China and India could use on their power plants, that means China and India can maintain their levels of growth without having to risk causing undue environmental destruction. Another importance here is that specifically poverty leads to worsening global warming. In countries like China and India, where people are poor, they don't have that much access to money, they don't have that much access to infrastructure, it tends to lead to a lot of burning of fuels like kerosene, fuels like wood, fuels like coal, all of which are the worst fuels for global warming. Which means that the only scenario in which people invest in things like renewable energy, the only scenario in which people invest in things like solar, is a scenario where they have excess money to spare and prosperity that they can invest it in new technologies like renewable energy. This means we need to lift people out of poverty, or else we can never solve the problem of warming, which means we need to find a way to make fossil fuels sustainable. But our third and final contention is the issue of time frame. And the problem is that renewable energy is simply not happening fast enough, and U.S. government subsidies aren't changing that. Despite the fact that we've given hundreds of billions of dollars to the renewable energy sector, they continue to be decades away from developing anything that could effectively and cost-effectively replace fossil fuels. This means that if we want to be able to solve the problem of global warming in the 10 or 20 years that the IPCC says we need to, then we need to be able to find alternatives that can work now, not in 10 years. So even if renewable energies are the way of the future, we need an alternative that will get us to the future without irreparably damaging the environment, which is why we need to prioritize technological development of fossil fuels and why we need to support things like carbon capture and sequestration as a sustainable alternative.
I would guess only one. We only have 3 days. Or not really days.
We can call them days.
3 contentions, yeah.
I don't think we'll stop you.
Okay. Judges ready? And opponents?
Of course.
And my partner's ready. I will start now. My partner and I proudly negate the resolution. The USFG ought to prioritize development of fossil fuels over investment in alternative energy. We accept their value of utilitarianism and decreasing human suffering. We think that that is fair for both sides, and we will show you how we uphold that with our side of the resolution much more. We agree with all of their definitions. There will be no definitions debate. Going right into their contentions. Their first contention is about carbon capture and how this helps the environment, but it needs funding. We have 2 responses. The first is that currently the atmosphere is at 435 parts per million of carbon according to the EPA. And according to the EPA, once we reach 440 parts per million, the damage that we will have done to the environment will be irreparable. There will be nothing that we can do to turn back global warming and solve it, which means that trying to limit the carbon in the atmosphere will not have much of an impact. We are already so close that unless we get closer to completely eradicating fossil fuels, simply trying to make them a little bit better for the environment is not going to have the impact that we need. The best thing we can do is try to go as far away from fossil fuels as possible, and by investing in alternative energy, it is much more responsible for the long term. While in the short term it might seem like a good idea to try to invest in something that will limit harm to the environment, it is actually a death wish because of the fact that in the long term, the impact will be minimal because we are already so close to passing the point of no return. Additionally, this is an irresponsible decision because it sets a harmful precedent. Yes?
Question. Agreed. We are currently about 15 years away from crossing the threshold that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that we can realistically change all of our infrastructure to accept renewable energy within the next 15 years, or do you think we might need a faster solution like carbon capture and storage?
Absolutely not. We're not going to be able to change everything within the next 15 years, but my second response explains why it's still an extremely irresponsible decision economically and for the environment. When you decide to develop something, you're putting in money, you're putting in time, you're putting in man hours, and you're putting in effort. You're not going to put in all of this development into something just to try to take it out of prevalence. You're developing it and you're going to continue to use it. The fact is that if you're going to continue to develop something, it actually means that we're not going to develop something for the sake of its discontinuity. So this means that we're not going to be discontinuing fossil fuels as soon as we would be in the status quo if we develop them. Because as we make excuses for fossil fuels, saying that we're making them better for the environment, their use will continue. Additionally, because of the fact that it's an irresponsible decision, there's a time frame issue here, which I will get into more on the third contention, but fossil fuels, by definition, are finite. There's no way to make them entirely sustainable, because fossil fuels, there are a limited amount of these resources in the earth. There was simply no way to make it sustainable forever, and it's an irresponsible decision to develop something that we know is going to end, according to EPA estimates, by 2052. By 2052, we will have exhausted all of the fossil fuels currently in the earth. Moving on to our second contention, yes?
You've misquoted the statistic there. 2052 is when global consumption of oil is expected to peak. After that, it's going to decline naturally due to supply, which means that ultimately there's no economic impact to running out of fossil fuels because we will generally transition to other fuels without any kind of economic cost.
I'm glad that that's a statistic that you found. However, the statistic that I found, I'm positive that I can read and I read the statistic properly. We could have two different numbers here. However, the fact is that by definition, even if he is right, there are a limited number of fossil fuels in the world. They are not sustainable because there simply isn't an infinite amount of coal. There's not an infinite amount of oil, whereas there's an infinite amount of sun to create solar energy. We are setting ourselves up for failure by investing in something that is by definition going to end. Moving on to their second contention that developing fossil fuels is good for the economy. This is only a benefit based on the assumption that the alternative is suddenly forcing alternative energy onto everyone and forcing them to adapt. They say that it's a benefit because we're going to be making it so that we're not stopping China and India from using the fossil fuels that are currently bolstering their economy and pulling people out of poverty. However, this is only a benefit because of the fact that they're saying the alternative is going to stop this bolstering people and pushing and pulling them out of poverty. Their assumption is that we're advocating for suddenly forcing alternative energy on everyone immediately. This is not true. Investment in alternative energy means that in the future, yes.
Considering that China and India both say they're going to continue growing their emissions for the next 20 years, how are we going to prevent going over the 40 parts per million threshold if we don't force people, or at least strongly encourage people to lower their emissions, as you say you don't do?
Because of the fact that the development is not going to guarantee a cut in emissions, first of all, and second of all, because of the fact that they're already using the fossil fuels. And they say they're not going to stop using the fossil fuels. Sure, we should do something about it, but it should not be prioritized over using and investing in alternative energy. Alternative energy is more important because it is for the unforeseeable future. They're looking at the short term. However, this isn't about a policy that's going to help the economy. This is about helping the long-term utilitarian, helping take people out of suffering. If fossil fuels and our energy runs out completely, and we have simply spent our money developing fossil fuels to make them more fuel efficient and make them less harmful to the environment, instead of investing in the energy that is going to take us past 2052, there will be no alternative to fossil fuels. If we don't invest now, we're not saying that you cannot develop fossil fuels and make them less harmful to the environment, but this is about prioritization. And we're going to prioritize alternative energy because of the fact that it actually helps us in the long term instead of the short term. Moving on to the third point about time frame, they say that it's too far away, the idea that we're not going to be having enough alternative energy because it's such a far reach. However, we don't have time now to waste. There is a limited amount of time that we will have access to these fossil fuels, and if we don't invest now, no matter how bleak they may say the prospects look, there is no alternative. Finally, moving on to our two key contentions about why this is a negative thing and why this does not uphold decreasing human suffering. Our first is that developing fossil fuels encourages us to continue their use. We don't develop something and then take it out of use. We're encouraging the use of fossil fuels by prioritizing it over investing in alternative energy. It sets a really negative precedent. We can still invest in the development of fossil fuels and making them less harmful to the environment, but if we prioritize alternative energy over that, we make sure that we have a future past that. It is simply more important. You can do both at the same time, but we should prioritize this over whenever they are in conflict because it is more important. Second, developing the limited nature of fossil fuels means we must invest in alternative energy because we have no other choice. If we run out of fossil fuels and we haven't invested properly in alternative energy, there is no future, there is no energy, human suffering is increased. For those reasons, negate. Thank you.
I'm going to go over the negation case and then the affirmative case. Time begins now. I once again strongly affirm today's resolution. As there's no debate over the definitions or framework, I'll jump straight into the negation team's case. Their first point was talking about how it encourages the use of fossil fuels to invest in this development that we're talking about. However, the simple fact is the technological development my partner brings up is to make fossil fuels sustainable so that we do not continue raising emissions while we are still using fossil fuels. This is not to encourage fossil fuels long term. This is to make sure that fossil fuels right now do not push us past the point of no return before we have the technology to eliminate emissions whatsoever. Whether or not we get renewable energy in the future, it does not matter if it comes after we are already past this point of no return, which is within 10 to 20 years. This fossil fuel development, to make sure it is sustainable, is to keep us alive and keep us from passing this threshold while the technology, the renewable energy market, grows by itself. They said we can do both. But the simple fact is the development for fossil fuels requires government investment in order to succeed. But as I'll get into in their second point, renewable energy both does not need government investment and will in fact do worse with this government investment. Which brings me to their second point, which is that we need to develop this renewable energy now or we have no future. The simple fact is that is false. We do not need government investment in order to have a future. In fact, government investment in renewable energy actually kills the entire industry. The logic for this is that subsidies or investing in these companies helps to prop up companies that otherwise wouldn't survive in the market. In addition, all that the United States funding or investment in renewables would do is to help create more supply of renewable energy because you're making it cheaper or trying to make it easier to create these renewable sources. Problem is, we're not changing the demand whatsoever. All they're doing is making the supply higher. Empirically, this is proven to make the situation worse and make these renewable companies collapse. Because when they get subsidized, they start creating more renewable energy. But it is not in the near future that any companies, especially China and India, want to switch over to it. So we'll have the renewable energy, but very few people who want to use it. So instead, we see the collapse of these industries, which means they're less likely to be able to grow in the future. We see an 85% failure rate for government investment in renewable energy. 85% of all projects failed to have any positive effect whatsoever. Yes?
If the government's going to be investing in these companies and you say it's going to cause them to create more renewable energy, isn't that setting them up for success in the future because they have more experience in the field and they're developing further?
No, the problem there is that they seek to create more supply, but they do nothing about the fact that no one's using the renewable energy or very few people are using it. We see that we've had billions of dollars of investment in the solar industry, and yet solar is still only at max 0.2% of all of our energy consumption. It's not making it more widespread use, it's only trying to make it more widespread. But that will overall fail short-term and long-term. I'm sorry, not right now. Now moving on to the affirmative team's case. Our first point was that of carbon capture and sequestration. Against this, my opponents brought up that we are very near the threshold of no return where we cannot do anything about it. Global warming is irreparable. Yes, we agree. There is no turning back once we reach this point. But renewable energy does not solve within that time frame. We have been trying to get renewable energy since the 70s, and we are still decades away from getting anywhere near replacing all current fossil fuel emissions. So we see that we need to stop fossil fuels from having an impact while we can work out whether or not we can use renewable in the future. This technology will work out the problem now and prevent fossil fuels from being the liability that it currently is. In addition, they bring up that renewable could solve in this amount of time. Renewable energy sources need to be built first. That is one of the key problems with them, which means renewable, while long-term no emissions, in the short term has a lot more emissions than industries that are already in place, which means we would in fact be bringing ourselves closer to this threshold by developing renewable energy instead of minimizing all the impacts from fossil fuels while renewable energy industry develops itself. And again, they bring up how we can't change in the next 15 years, et cetera, how we have finite amounts. The simple fact is China and India are not changing what they're doing no matter what the threshold is, no matter what the United States is saying. They're not just going to decide to use renewable energy because their development currently relies on fossil fuels, on coal, natural gas, oil, etc. Their economies and dragging people out of poverty relies on this. So yes, it is a bit of a short-term solution to have this fossil fuel technology that'll catch all the emissions. But we need that short-term solution or there's no time for a long-term one. Because if we don't have our economies and our environment survive for the next 15 to 20 years, there's no point if by then we've finally developed a long-term solution. There's no time to implement it because all of the resources are already gone. So we see we can implement this fossil fuel technology in the next 10 to 15 years easily, probably far sooner, which means all carbon emissions from this immediately stops because we're catching all of it. So carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels aren't happening, which means we're not getting closer to this threshold while we seek to try to get renewable for the long term. Without this short-term solution, there can be no long term. And once again, the fact that my partner brought up is in fact true. Fossil fuel use will peak by then, not necessarily be out of it. I'm sorry, I really don't have time. So we see the fact that they're still using coal, they're not turning back. It is necessary to have this technology to prevent going past this point of no return. Our second point was talking about how development better for economies. My opponent said this is only beneficial for forcing them onto alternative energy sources. But the simple fact is, if we don't do that, we won't reach the goal and we'll pass the threshold anyways. China and India need to stop emitting somehow, and they're not going to switch to renewable energy. So the only way is to prioritize making the technology that can allow them to keep using that without emitting whatsoever, which means we can solve in the long term. As for time frame, as I've already addressed somewhat, we don't have time to waste. We agree, that was their only refutation. But the fact is, this short-term solution of technology for stopping the emission of carbon, of fossil fuels, is what we need in the short term so we can buy ourselves more time to find a more long-term solution. Without this, while just trying to develop renewable energy will not only stunt the growth of renewable energy and prevent it from solving, but it will not solve fast enough. For all these reasons, I strongly affirm.
Ready? Are you going neg or rap first?
I'm going to go neg first and app.
Okay.
Any judges ready? Right. Starting time now. So first, beginning with the negations case, our first contention is that developing fossil fuels does not cut usage. Basically, the fact is that their entire solution is to figure out a way where we're going to reduce pollution, basically get rid of the carbon emissions that fossil fuels emit. However, it's still using fossil fuels, which is a limited resource. We're going to be running out of these fossil fuels before we find an alternative energy solution, which we are eventually going to need in the long term. They basically respond to this by saying that technological development does not encourage their use. However, the fact is, and they've said it before, China and India have stated that they're going to continue to use fossil fuels, this usage is going to keep occurring, and technological development is going to be encouraging the use of these fossil fuels because there won't be pollution, there won't be the negative effects of it, but it's still going to be a finite resource. So because of this, I'll take a POI in a bit. I just want to get through this point. So basically, it's still going to be encouraging the usage of these fossil fuels because it's getting rid of the carbon emissions. These countries are going to see it's getting rid of the carbon emissions, and they're going to continue to use it. And as my partner brought it up before, we're going to be out of all known oil reserves by 2052. This was not a misquote. We actually found from the ASPO that global oil production peaked in 2005. It's not going to peak in 2052. It peaked in 2005. It already peaked. It's been declining since then. So considering that, all known deposits are going to be gone by 2052. Yes.
I'm sorry to correct you again. U.S. oil production peaked in 2005, and then it kept growing again starting in 2010. Global oil production has grown by 2% per year for the past few years.
All right, it appears that we have some sort of different sources. However, according to my source, it has been declining ever since 2005. It didn't continue to grow again. This is a recent source. So considering that we are running out of oil reserves, we are going to lose fossil fuel as a resource eventually. So considering that the short-term solution doesn't apply, if we don't invest in alternative energy now, we're not going to have an alternative energy source by the time we need it. So when we run out of fossil fuels, we won't have any energy. It's going to be increasing human suffering, which is today's value, because we won't have any alternative to turn to. Even though we won't have any more negative effects of fossil fuels, we'll still have no fossil fuels by the time we're done using them. So moving on to our second contention is that there's no other choice. Yes.
Can you clarify what is the economic impact of running out of fossil fuels? Because usually when a market runs out of a commodity, that just means that there'll be an incentive to develop alternatives, which means that if and when we do run out of fossil fuels, we can safely replace them with renewable energy, but we need to act to reduce their emissions in the short term.
There is a time in between the point where we run out of fossil fuels and the point that we implement a new technology where nobody will have access to fuel. This is an incredibly huge detriment because of how much we rely on fossil fuel. So simply saying that we need to run out of fossil fuel before we can implement alternative energy simply isn't true. We need to do so before we reach that point, and we can't do that unless we develop energy that we have ready to use before that we reach that point. So there's going to be a huge detriment to the economy, detriment to everybody who is dependent on this resource because we won't have it anymore before we're able to implement alternative energy. So we have no other choice. We have to invest in alternative energy. They basically said that we don't need government investment and that there's only going to be more supply. There's not going to be any demand. However, first of all, we need the government to be investing. First of all, because it's going to set a precedent. It's going to show other countries that we're turning to alternative energy sources. We're turning away from fossil fuel dependence, and it's going to be giving us and it's going to show. And considering that the U.S. federal government is a world power, it's going to be setting a precedent internationally. Then, sorry, I have a lot to get through. Maybe later. Basically, in response to how with supply, there's not changing in demand. Demand is going to stem from depletion. Basically, as we're running out of fossil fuels, there's a threat of planet destruction. People are going to have more demand. We don't have alternative energy, we don't have enough supply right now, so there can be no demand because we don't have enough right now. But as we develop these alternative energy sources in the future, as we increase the supply, there will be demand, considering how dire it is that we turn to this new energy resource, and we're going to be running out of fossil fuels anyways. So if there is going to be demand, because oil prices will just continue to rise, and demand grows with time, we need to be prepared. Just like as time goes on, as we're running out of fossil fuels, the demand is going to increase. We haven't reached, it's slowly, there's a changing demand, it's increasing. And then also, they say there's a failure rate of investment currently. Well, we haven't prioritized it, and we already are prioritizing fossil fuels currently. So because we haven't prioritized alternative energy in the past, of course there's a failure rate. We haven't spent enough time investing in alternative energy sources, enough of our resources to figure out how we can make it work. Sorry, I have a lot to get through, maybe towards the end.
That's okay.
Moving on to the affirmations case. Basically, their first contention, their entire case stems around carbon capture and storage, basically storing the carbon dioxide from fossil fuel emissions. Now, basically, both teams agree that we're reaching a point of no return as far as the pollution in the environment and detriments to the earth. And now they say that the renewable energy does not solve in the time frame. That's because we're not prioritizing renewable energy currently, and they also have no precedent poor success with carbon capture, they give us no reason to believe that carbon capture is going to be solving in this time frame because they have no precedent for this working on such a large scale. They have no evidence to show that it's going to be able to stop it before the point of no return. So we're focusing all of our resources on stopping it before the point of no return, and it doesn't work out because there is no precedent. That we're basically going to have nothing to turn to. We won't have alternative energy, which is why we need to be prioritizing that first. Then they respond to, so their second contention is that developing fossil fuels is better for the economy, and I don't have a lot of time left, so I'll just kind of loop it in with the time frame. Basically, it's saying that their responses our responses is that we need a short-term solution now. We need something as quick as possible before we reach the threshold. Again, they admit it's short-term. We don't have a long-term solution. That's where alternative energy needs to be prioritized because we need that long-term solution. And then the fact that carbon capture has no precedent of success, they haven't given us a precedent. If they try to come in the last speech and give us a precedent, it gives us no chance to respond to it. However, the fact is that we don't have, there's no proof that carbon capture is going to stop pollution to the point of no return. So we need some sort of other energy source to turn to. So for all those reasons, it's just simply going to be increasing human suffering. Vote negation. Thank you.
Opponent's ready? Judge is ready. And partner's ready. Starting time now. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Congratulations on making it this far. And now it is my job as the final negation speaker to really crystallize today's debate into 3 key voter issues as to why we'll be voting for the negative today. First is the time frame. This has been a big issue throughout today's debate, and the affirmation is basically saying that we need a solution in the short term. However, they completely ignore my contention that says that developing fossil fuels encourages us to continue their use. And the more we rely on fossil fuels, the less we invest in alternative energy, and the more amount of time that it takes for us to develop this alternative. The broader of that time that it takes in between us running out of fossil fuels and us actually having the alternative energy we need to function as a society. Fuel is necessary for any economy to work, for any human to evade suffering. Fuel is a part of our society, a part of our economy, and for that reason, we can't just live without fuel. So what is their alternative? Once fossil fuels run out, what do they think we're going to do? If we don't invest in fossil fuels, if we don't invest in alternative energy now, then we won't have developed enough technology to be able to have effective alternative energy that will actually solve the problems and be able to replace fossil fuel. We've had fossil fuel for so long, we're already incredibly dependent on it, which is why people are so resistant to the idea of switching to alternative energy. However, as I said in my contention, developing fossil fuels encourages us to continue their use, which is an extremely harmful precedent to set. In the time frame, sure, they solve some issues in the short term. Once again, as my partner stated, they don't guarantee that they're going to solve this or stop us from going past the point of no return because of the fact that their technology requires investment, our technology requires investment. It's about which one should be prioritized on the moral level and which one is going to decrease human suffering. And the answer is a long-term solution will decrease the most human suffering and avoid that point in time where there's no fuel whatsoever. The important thing is the time frame here, making sure that we have a solution for the long term, for the unforeseeable future, instead of just the years that we're going to be trying to help mitigate the issues that we've already caused by relying on fossil fuels by continuing to use fossil fuels. They're not going to decrease any kind of human suffering, and it is not until we invest in alternative energy and prioritize alternative energy that we will ever have a solution for the future. Fossil fuels are by definition finite, and if we run out, there is no alternative unless we invest now. Moving on to the second voter issue, which is effectiveness. The fact is that they try to say that we're not going to be able to invest enough into alternative energy for it to be effective or to make any kind of real change. But the reality is that investment and making sure that we're developing things makes them effective. They talk about supply and demand, but as my partner stated, demand rises as fossil fuels run out. We're not going to be able to force fossil fuels to run out. The demand is going to rise, and it's not a net detriment to be developing that energy now. They try to say that the government giving these companies subsidies makes them develop more energy, and as I asked in a POI, Why is that going to be negative? Why is that going to affect the demand? But the fact is, it's a good thing. As I stated, it's a good thing that we're going to be increasing their familiarity with alternative energy. The more that they create, the more they'll be able to develop. So it's not a negative thing that they're creating more alternative energy right now. It will be useful in the future. The demand isn't there yet because we have not run out yet. But that point will come, and that demand will exist invariably. And our third and final voter issue is who upholds the value in this round of decreasing human suffering. Our value is utilitarianism, the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. However, decreasing human suffering here is about, in the long term, how many people's suffering do we decrease? Do we decrease in the short term? The number of people suffering from the current effects of the climate change and the pollution and the fossil fuels? Or in the long term, if you negate, are we going to be decreasing the suffering of all of those who would have to otherwise live without any kind of energy? In a world that has no alternative energy is about having an alternative to fossil fuels. Without alternative energy, there is no energy whatsoever. Without an alternative, we have no energy. We increased human suffering without that energy, and there's absolutely no reason to think that they decreased human suffering more. Sure, they provided some economic advantages with China and India, but look at the value they provided today. It's about decreasing human suffering. And what they're actually going to be doing is increasing human suffering if we don't invest in an alternative energy now. The alternative energy is our only hope for having anything past fossil fuels. There is no alternative. They provide you no alternative to alternative energy. And the fact is that we need to invest in it now to limit human suffering, to ensure we have a long-term solution. For all of those reasons, I urge a negation ballot. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to go over basically an overview. If you are flowing on paper or whatever, you might want to get a new tab. It's not that long, but that's going to be my overview of the round. I'll do some long, and then I'll go over the negative case first and then the affirmative case.
Wait, where do you want us to follow? Somewhere new.
Yeah,
Okay.
would be best. Everyone ready? Look, if I could switch over the United States energy system and the world energy system today to using renewable energy instead of fossil fuels, I would. Sadly, and this is the problem with the negative team is arguing this round, we can't. And the fact that it will take decades of infrastructure development to create a renewable energy system that could power the world means that we need a short-term solution in order to solve warming in the short term. Because if we don't, as they say, there will be no long term. I'll say a brief word about our value criterion, which again is reducing suffering. We both agree that this debate is basically about global warming and about solving global warming. We agree that global warming causes suffering in the forms of floods, in the form of displacement, war, etc. And so it's a question of who can best solve for global warming in the round, which is the most significant cause of suffering. And that said, our first voting issue is that we don't have time to wait. We need a solution now because otherwise there will be no future in which we can develop things like renewable energy. In fact, I will quote their first speaker, who said that we are at 435 parts per million, and that if we get to 440 parts per million, this is what they say, the increase in temperature becomes irreversible. This means that the only way we can solve warming is if we find a way right now to slow down the kinds of rapid growth that's occurring in emissions. And as they have conceded and failed to argue in this round, the only way to make that happen in a short enough time period to solve before about 2025, which is when we reach that threshold, is through carbon capture and storage, is through developing technologies that allow us to control those emissions instead of simply wishing people would switch to fossil fuels. Now, they talk a lot about the long term. First, as I said, we need to get to the long term first, which means that if global warming becomes irreversible in the next 10 years, which is what they say would happen if we don't curtail emissions enough, then it doesn't matter how much progress we make after that because the problem is already unsolvable. We need something that will work now. And furthermore, they've conceded that renewable energy will do fine on its own and in fact gets harmed by government investment, which means the best thing we can do to encourage the development of renewable energy in the long term is to leave it alone and let the market develop it and let competition, let the strongest solar companies and wind companies win out. But our second voting issue specifically is that same issue that renewable energy does better without government investment. When you give subsidies to a company, that company will tend to succeed in the market even if the product that it's producing isn't very good. This means that if we simply leave the solar market alone, leave the wind market alone, as we've largely been doing, then that means the strongest companies will win. instead of companies like Solyndra, companies that are not that good and are not producing that effective a product, and yet are able to succeed and prop themselves up on government subsidies. So even if you believe, as they say, that the most important thing is to develop renewable energy, they're straight up conceding that the best way to develop renewable energy is not through government investment, is not through further subsidies. It's by leaving the market alone and letting competition allow the strongest companies to win. Those are two independent reasons to vote for these funds. That said, let's get into the negative case. They have this issue they talk about a lot throughout their case, which is that we're going to run out of oil in 2052, and that when we do, we're going to have a gap where no one gets fuel, and the lights will all go out, and then it'll take us a few years to develop renewable energy. First, remember, their statistics are wrong here. 2052 is simply when global oil consumption peaks, and it will slowly be replaced by other fuels like solar and wind. But second, that's not how the market works. As the supply of oil dwindles, the prices would inevitably go up, which creates incentives, as they say, to invest in things like solar and wind, which means that we're never going to run out of fossil fuels, because by the time fossil fuels become that scarce, we will have already switched to other kinds of fuels that are now cheaper. This means there's no way that we're going to run out of fuels and have no access to being able to turn the lights on or whatever. It's just a question of can we solve warming in the next few years. Furthermore, they're failing to prove to you that our investment in technology would encourage the development of fossil fuels. Think about it. Do we lower the price of fossil fuels? Do we lower anything? Do we make them more economical to invest in? No. We just make them safer for the environment. This means that we have no impact on the usage of fossil fuels. We just make sure that whatever usage of fossil fuels there is would ultimately be less disastrous to the environment than it could be. On their second contention about how we need energy, I would like to extend the argument they make about how the depletion of fossil fuels would lead to demand for renewable energy. We agree, but that's the reason why we'll never run out of fossil fuels, because by the time we get close, we will inevitably have switched over to other fuels that are now cheaper due to supply and demand. Finally, getting on to our affirmative case, they make this new argument that carbon capture and storage won't solve fast enough, and we don't have an example of how it would work. I think we have lots of examples. We've already told you that it's working in a number of test plants, but that with U.S. investment, it could spread to other kinds of plants that right now view it as uneconomical. Plus, the fact that you don't need to build any new infrastructure, the fact that all you need to do is attach some machinery to the smokestacks that you already have, means that carbon capture and storage is a more economical alternative. You vote F because we need to get to the future before we can worry about the long term. We have to do something so that we don't go over the threshold in the next 10 years, and the only way to do that is to invest in the development of fossil fuels and invest in technologies like carbon capture and storage that can stop the growth in emissions and save us from the impacts of global warming. Thank you for judging. Vote F. Should we step up, though?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, we just did.